Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
So this week, I think we should talk about one of FM Alexander's core concepts, which is inhibition. So what is inhibition, and how does inhibition play out during a lesson of conscious guidance and control?
Yes, that's a very good introduction. We are going to discuss, but more so, I want to demonstrate what I'm going to say about inhibition, because in the modern Alexander technique, how it is practiced nowadays, inhibition is present, of course. Most people talk about it, but the way I teach, I don't use the word with the same meaning. There is a very different meaning, and what I want to demonstrate is that meaning is related to movements and coordination of movements. And the best way to do that is to go back to Alexander's writing. And it's interesting to start with one quote. And that quote is not part of the main books proper. It was in the first one, in the first edition of Man's Supreme Inheritance, but Alexander wrote it a little bit earlier in another document that he had. And it's quite interesting to see how it relates to what we did together, which is a small lesson of conscious guidance, where I ask you to, of course, understand some orders of movement with the best explanation I could give you. And once you produce the movements, there was a phase of control where I started to ask you questions about the movements I wanted you to perform, and also other movements that were incidental, that were not the main idea, but that these movements appeared during the process of sending the correct directions. And the whole lesson was about, in fact, refining how you were producing the gesture I wanted. And this refining was not by making the correct movement more present, more visible. It was most of the time by asking you why you were doing other movements that were not part of the instructions. And you discovered that when I wanted you to move the hand, for example, with a ruler, there was suddenly the question of what you were doing with the elbow, with the wrist. And of course, these were not part of the orders as such. The order was, for example, to turn a ruler so that you could pinpoint a spot. And we found that there were different ways, different manner of moving the parts of the arm and shoulder in order to, of course, perform the gesture. This is where we can make a fundamental difference between what we call exercises, where you, well, describe roughly what is the end of the gesture, and the person try to reproduce the end. For example, the tip of the ruler has to touch a very special bone on the body. Are you there or not? You could work on this, but it was not what I asked you. What I asked you was clearly to have an idea of an end. So yes, point the spot with the ruler, but we were more interested in how you could use your mind to direct movements that were appearing on screen without a proper control, a proper guidance on your part. Where was the palm? Where was the base of the forearm? Where was the elbow? Where was the shoulders? And suddenly, instead of performing one action, you were in fact starting to organize the movements and what we call the coordination of the movements of the many parts that were involved in obtaining the goal. This is the idea that any gesture, any complex or simple movement has to be produced, or we say projected to the screen, because we want to have an objective reading of that gesture using means whereby to obtain it. The trajectory of the elbow, the trajectory of the shoulder are very important to the end. They are what makes the end reproducible, what makes the end accurate, and what makes also the overall involvement of the person into the gesture. It's not just a simple movement. It's always something that calls to your intellectual capacity, your cognitive organization, because you have to perform against, of course, the fact that you're filmed, that you're under stress. Most people do not realize that when I ask somebody to perform a gesture, there is stress involved. There is a teacher there, and you're not acting normally. As soon as you're on stage, well, that was the idea of Alexander. He was an actor, and he knew about that stress of performing. Even if you perform for yourself, you're under stress. If you suggested a mirror in a room and you ask a person to just enter and stand there to wait, and you film what is happening, you will find that the fact that there is a mirror, the person is not going to react, because the person is like projecting her own image. She's on stage for herself. So imagine when you're on stage for a teacher that is asking you questions, and that there is, of course, people that are going to watch this image. You are under a lot of stress. It's basic, but it's very interesting that we need to learn to respond, to react to that situation. It's not just a question of how you sit, how you stand. No, no, no. You sit and you stand in front of an audience, even if the audience is just you. Very often, the judge people carry in their head, and that is talking to them all the time, is even more frightening than the judge that is out there in the audience. Because the most of the time, the teacher that I am just watching the performance, and I'm just asking questions and stating facts. Said, well, your elbow went up, your shoulder went up. Is that necessary? Is that something you could change? So as long as you don't try, we don't know. There is no sort of, you're not doing the right thing, you should be better. No, that is inside our own head when we are ourselves in the position of working with a teacher. So where this relates with inhibition, you will understand from the introduction that inhibition has very many different levels, where we will be interested in improving your capacity to guide yourself. And when we say guide yourself in the initial Alexander technique, when we think about conscious guidance and control, conscious guidance and conscious control basis is ordering oneself, which means that we are going to use verbal speech, what we call self-speech. I don't even need to pronounce it aloud. I can give myself instructions as to what movement I want to see perform on screen and what movement I don't want to see perform on screen. This is basically the inhibition of movement. And I want to demonstrate that this idea comes straight from Alexander's writing. It's not an invention of my part, of the initial Alexander technique, if you want. No, no, it's really part of the core of what Alexander used in order to change his own manner of producing gestures. So to start with, it's quite funny to, I've just changed my mind. I wanted to start straight away with the first time where Alexander mentioned inhibitions, but I think that it's better to introduce it first. And so there is a quite a funny sentence in the second book of Alexander that came much later in 1923. And Alexander says briefly, those who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to undertake to act as teachers are well aware of the difficulty of finding an adult who can, as we say, think of more than one thing at a time and perform satisfactorily any evolution requiring the coordinated use of even two parts of the organism. So in the 1946 edition, this is page 167. It's a funny sentence, in fact. It introduces a very long passage where Alexander is going to define what he means by projecting orders, projecting verbal orders, and what he called continued orders, so that you have to project one order of movement and continue it, continue to project that order while you project the second one, and continue to project these two orders and project a third one, and so forth, until for well, the necessity of the gesture you're requested to perform. So it's quite interesting to have a look at this sentence, and there are a few things I want to discuss about it. Well, the first part is those who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to act as teachers. I say to all my pupils, they can be teachers of the modern Alexander technique or students of mine, or they can be people coming because they want to improve their capacity of being present in a meeting, in a call, or they want to improve a part of their capacity of direct their attention properly. I always told them from the start that this distinction between teacher and student is not real. That as soon, because many people are telling me, yes, but I don't want to be a teacher. Because very often during the lesson I tell them, well, you're going to interact with the pupil, and they say, no, I'm not going to interact with the pupil because I'm not going to be a teacher. I don't want to be a teacher. And in fact, I tell them that well, they are going to be anyway. They can't escape it. And I base this on Alexander's writing that he was his first pupil. He taught himself his technique, and I think that what I'm doing is just helping other people to teach this technique, whether to themselves or to others. Doesn't make a difference. So by the interaction that we have between a person and another one calling himself a teacher of the Alexander technique, you're becoming a teacher yourself. You're going to have to deal with yourself and to give yourself orders and to verify how you perform these orders. That's the experiment I do with my pupils are just ideas of experiment that the pupil can perform by himself. You just need to have a small camera on your computer, and you can give yourself orders and then perform a gesture in front of the camera. That's it. You're going to consciously control what you've done according to the orders. Have you translated the verbal orders into action? Have you done this bridge? Have you constructed the bridge between theory and practice? If it's so, you're a teacher. So that is the first thing. So Alexander is saying that we have a difficulty finding an adult who can think of more than one thing at a time. Well, that is stupid, of course, because we do think of many things at a time, all the time. For example, I am not, my first language is not English. So when I speak to you, well, there is something going on in my mind. I have to think of more than one thing at a time, just because, for example, I have to translate to myself what I want to say. That's one. The second is, of course, I have a plan for this interview. It's obvious. So I am speaking and thinking in advance of what I'm going to say next. So why is Alexander saying that thinking of more than a thing at a time is difficult? Well, I think that the second part of the sentence explains that, because he says difficulty to find an adult who can perform satisfactorily any evolution, any gesture requiring coordinated use of even two parts of the organism. Well, he's not talking about thinking in general. He's about thinking in activity. And he really mentions physical activity. So yes, if you start to ask a person to perform a gesture, any sort of simple gesture, I want you to raise your arm, I want you to lean back or lean forward, which are obviously very simple, you will find that if you ask the person, if you make an experiment where you ask the person to perform that gesture and think at the same time of more than two things, oh yes, then you will discover as teacher of yourself that, whoa, you're not used to that. You're well using to thinking of something while performing a very spontaneous gesture. But if you ask to think of something and to perform a very conscious, well-ordered gesture, oh dear, there is a conflict then. There is a difficulty of keeping in mind, well, either one of the two things. Well, first of all, recognizing the difficulty is not an insult, it's just a starting point. We suddenly discover, wow, yes, oh, clever. It's very difficult to do it spontaneously. On the spontaneous basis, the somatic cognition is incapable of, in fact, reacting in the proper way. And I say reacting in the proper way because most of the time, when the first time the person discover that difficulty as teacher of himself, well, the first thing is stress. The first thing is self-image. The first thing is, self-image meaning, wow, I'm not looking good here. I'm in trouble. I don't want to appear like this. So when a person is teaching himself, very often what happens is that the person will tend to discard the experiment because the experiment didn't feel nice. The experiment was not satisfactory. It was not showing the best part of ourselves. So most of the time, the person will discard. So sometimes, as a teacher, I am there to help the person to come around that fact and gently start, well, developing the capacity to think of more than one thing at a time, developing the capacity of coordinating orders and coordinating the action that these orders are pointing to. And so the person suddenly discovered that all that first elementary reaction that the judge say, but this is, you don't know this, you don't know how to do this, this is wrong. This is putting you in a bad light. Well, you tend to start to be capable of having that voice toned down. I know, yes, it's part of the game. It's what we call experiment. There is always a next experiment to come. So it's better that I realize today that I'm unable to perform this action and to think of more than one thing at a time, than in fact place it under the carpet and forget about it, well, for it to fester. Because it's never going to improve if I just think about something else that is more, I want to think of some where I'm easy. I want to think easy thoughts and easy ideas and easy feelings. Well, you can. Well, you're just sidestepping, but the problem is still there. So it's somehow more intelligent to start to deal with the real thing. And so Alexander is talking about performing satisfactorily. So there is the word evolution for in this idea. We are engaged into not one act. It's not one act now. I want you to lift the ruler and point to the ceiling with the hilt is now. There is no evolution in that. The evolution in that is that you can, well, point the sword tip to the floor and the hilt to the ceiling, and more start to control how the whole system is, in fact, performed without the torso being impacted by it, without the habitual lifting of one shoulder and the whole disequilibrium that comes out of just using one hand. I've seen people raising their hands to touch somebody, and every time they were doing that, there was no evolution whatsoever. They were still, without their knowledge, subconsciously performing different movements with parts that were out of their attention because they couldn't direct their mind on more than one object at a time. And so they were arching their back, protruding their belly. They were doing everything that Alexander considered as incorrect mechanical acts. So yes, it's not easy to first take a lesson, especially if you have an idea of your training and your value and your capacity of coordination. You're asked to raise an arm, and yes, we see what level of coordination you're able to, in fact, direct. And at first, well, it's surprisingly small. So it's not easy, but it's very quickly something of an interest, because Alexander is saying that, well, difficulty of finding somebody we can coordinate movements, well, that's why we are here for. Of course, we want to reduce that difficulty. We are going to become more and more capable of directing our mind on more than one thing at a time in activity. And we are going to be more and more capable, of course, of, as I say, coordinating. And that's the last thing I want to point to that sentence, because there is a very big problem of language with Alexander's writing. Because if you take the sentence word by word, I want you to see that there is a big problem. He says the difficulty to find an adult we can perform satisfactorily any evolution requiring the coordinated use of even two parts. The coordinated use of even two parts. Alexander, every single time, is talking about coordinating parts, or coordinating the use of parts. Well, it's a very strange way of saying things, because you cannot coordinate parts. You can maybe coordinate the use of the parts if you understand that by use you mean your capacity of directing movements of these parts. Coordination of parts doesn't mean anything. You cannot order one part. You cannot order two parts. You can only order the movements of the parts relatively to one another and relatively to external planes of reference. So we have to be very clear in our teaching, especially when I deal with modern Alexander teacher, that when I say I coordinate, I coordinate the movements of the parts. For example, when you direct your hand toward a special spot in space that you have decided would be the aim, well, you have to coordinate the movement of the elbow and the movement of the shoulder and the movement of the center of the torso and the movement of the middle of the torso. It's like sensible to speak in that way. There is a danger to use concept or sentences that have no physical reality. Coordinating parts is such an expression that is very dangerous. It has an advantage, of course, because if you say coordinating parts, you can mean anything. So who's going to come and contest or question what you're saying? I've seen many teachers using such sentences because these sentences played them at a different level. They were above us and they were just saying, I have had an experience and you haven't. And because of that, you cannot understand what I'm saying. If you had the experience, you would understand. It's very easy to make people believe that you're on top. What is very fantastic with movements is movements don't lie. When you sit down, for example, it's a gesture. And anybody that knows about coordination of movements will see whether you coordinate the parts or whether you coordinate the movements of the parts. If you coordinate the movements of the part, well, the whole trajectory can be, of course, seen to be exactly what was present in the orders. Otherwise, the person is just simulating good use. It's I've seen many people simulating good use. And as soon as the lesson was finished, you would follow them and have a rest or drink a cup of coffee. And suddenly they were not simulating anymore. It's very strange. So that point, when we are going to talk about inhibition, what I wanted to demonstrate is that Alexander sees inhibition at first as a very concrete process. There are many people nowadays that think that inhibition is like a philosophy in the Alexander technique. It's not. So let's go back to 1908. There is a little pamphlet called Reeducation of the Kinesthetic System, written by F.M. Alexander. Sorry. And in this pamphlet, we have the best introduction to inhibition relating to conscious guidance and control. This is Alexander speaking, of course. I may briefly explain orders concerning definite inhibition by stating that the teacher will have to deal with incorrect movements unconsciously performed. These movements occurring at the moment when the teacher dictates the orders, we call conscious guiding order, necessary to bring about coordination of different parts of the mechanism, assert themselves and become primary and hinder the performance of the correct and coordinated movements as ordered. It is therefore as necessary to order the inhibition of incorrect and unconsciously performed acts as to give orders which will secure the coordinated use of the mechanism involved. So I am going to use that sentence to demonstrate that inhibition can be easily explained if we understand that we are talking about coordination of movements. And of course, if I do that, my plan is to show that Alexander was about using orders to order different movements, not orders that are like a way to remember the feeling we had when a teacher moved us in a certain disposition. So there is something Alexander called definite inhibition. It's not easy. It's not a sort of attitude of mind that you're going to say to yourself, I'm going to take the time to think. Most people think that inhibition is that. So definite inhibition is not. So the concept of inhibition cannot be separated from this idea of lesson of conscious guidance and control. That is, Alexander is clearly showing that when he says that the teacher, well, of course, it's a teacher of coordinated actions that is teaching either himself or someone else, the teacher will have to deal with incorrect movement unconsciously performed. The pupil is not aware he's doing anything special with the different parts of the organism when he's requested to perform an activity. You ask somebody to, for example, sit down on a chair. The person has no idea what the left knee is doing. Is the left knee going faster than the right? The person would suddenly stop in his track and say, "What? I have no idea. How could you know that?" Well, you could. If a teacher, somebody that is looking at you performing the gesture, is asking you the question, and you reproduce the experiment to see whether it is true or not, to see whether you can accelerate the other knee, to see what it would be if you were accelerating the other one. And so experiments are necessary, of course, to deal with incorrect movement. The second point that is fundamental, that is why definite inhibition has to be understood within the context of the lesson of conscious guidance and control of coordinated movements, is that Alexander explained that these movements that are unconsciously performed by the person, well, they occur only when the teacher dictates the orders, the conscious guiding orders necessary to bring about the coordination of the movements of the different parts of the mechanism. So Alexander is saying that he's giving orders that are necessary to bring about the coordination of the movements of the different parts of the mechanism. It's simple as that. He's not giving orders to make the pupil remember the feeling he experienced it when the teacher placed the pupil in the correct position. Not at all. He's teaching people how to create the movement that are necessary to assume a position of mechanical advantage. So if when the person is moving the hand, we can see that there is an excessive involvement of one part of the torso, this is an incorrect movement. So it's written clearly, incorrect movements are performed. So there must be correct movements. Alexander must know which are these correct movements. Of course, we have an idea that the conscious guidance of the movements of the mechanism of the torso are in fact designed to allow an expansion, an harmonic expansion of the torso, a lengthening and a widening. So any movement you see yourself perform, when you're trying to perform correct movements as ordered, well, if they don't expand the mechanism of the torso, they are simply incorrect. So the performance of the correct and coordinated movement as ordered is another indication that you are taught in the lesson of conscious guidance and control to perform correct and coordinated movements as ordered. The orders are orders of correct coordinated movements. Fine. You're just giving orders and you perform. And the teacher is looking at you, or you are looking at your performance, looking at a video or a recording. And what you observe is not so much whether the correct movements have been performed. What you observe is what other movements appear on screen. Most of the time, we are not aware that we are performing these movements. We had this interesting thing about the base of the palm going back in space and the elbow going forward. And you found that, wow, that was really difficult. That was, well, not difficult in the sense that you didn't want to do it. No, difficult in the sense that there were movements appearing every single time on video that were not part of your perception when you were performing these movements. These actions were as if hidden from your attention. And they were not feelings, they were trajectories. Seeing one point going from one spot to another one at a certain speed. This is a trajectory. It's not something we feel. And if you try and feel, you will be further from discovering how to organize the mind to direct the movement, because the feeling occurs after the movement has occurred. And you cannot use something that occurs after to, in fact, plan the movement to happen. So the lesson is necessarily one-to-one for that reason. It's impossible to give a lesson to a group, because when the group is hearing the correct orders, you have no idea what sort of incorrect movement unconsciously performed each member of the group is going to perform. You cannot plan. I mean, as a teacher, you cannot know in advance how a person is going to perform an action, so that you could say, when you're going to perform that action, your left elbow is going to be further back than your left base of the palm, while on the right, it's going to be much better. It's impossible to know in advance. So there is no, you cannot reach, there is no lesson. You cannot reach the reasoning of a person in a group, because the reasoning we want to reach is the reasoning that says, well, when I'm performing this action, I don't feel, but I've seen on screen, it's been pointed to me time and time again that I do not move the tip of the elbow faster than the base of the palm, for example. And this has an impact on the relationship between the top of the torso and the middle, such that without understanding exactly why, if I forget about what I do and that I should not do, if I not forget, I mean, if I haven't got an order of definite inhibition telling myself, oh dear, I am going to perform that act, I don't care about so much about the end. What I care is about what is it I am doing that I should stop when I perform the action, the gesture, the whole action. And so you think, yes, I have to direct my memory, not my feelings. I have to order myself to stop something. I have to give myself orders to order the inhibition of incorrect and unconsciously performed act. And when Alexander says acts, is just not to repeat once more, movement. There is the act is only, the conscious act is only a movement that has been ordered in advance, planned, and that happens despite the fact that when I'm in action, I don't feel these things. I don't know I'm doing them. I don't, no, I don't I'm doing them. There is a difference. Being aware maybe is more or less feeling something happening. I am not aware of them. I know I do them because I've seen myself on screen many times performing the same action with the same incorrect movements. So when you take a lesson of conscious guidance, it's like you are going deeper and deeper into coordinations that are habitual to us. We coordinate movements all the time. I've heard some teachers saying that I was all into doing, into planning movements. Well, fine. Yes, I agree. I receive the objection. Yes, easily. We all do. We all coordinate movements all the time. The question is to inquire into what is the result, how we do coordinate them, and how we could improve. It's all about change in the right direction, how to get an evolution and not an involution of movement, because the rule is that most people are just having a devolution. They are not improving. They are they rest on their habits. So we have to discuss the question of habits in the perspective of conscious guidance and control, because most of the time habits do not get better, they get worse all the time. So we have here a model in this 1908 explanation, where Alexander makes a very clear distinction between orders of definite performance. The orders of definite performance are the order the teacher gives himself or gives his pupil in order to program coordinated activity. But Alexander points to the fact from the very start, that you cannot find an individual who can do that. They will perform subconsciously incorrect movement. Yes, all the time. They will, you will see on screen that, well, in order to achieve the movements, the correct coordinated movements, they produce other movements that are not wanted. And this is an individual thing. You cannot anticipate with a pupil what sort of incorrect movement he's going to perform. You have to be there. You have to look at the film. You have to, that's my role as a teacher. I'm really observing what sort of movements appear when the pupil is performing, well, translating into action, a series of instructions, of correct instruction to expand the torso. I know the person is doing his best. I just look at it very calmly and I say, yes, what you're doing is going in the right direction with this, and this. But first of all, you must integrate other orders into the planning, into the guidance of the performance, because there are movements that appear that are unconsciously performed, and this order will make it impossible for you to secure the end, which is coordination of movements as a whole. That's the plot Alexander is talking about. Yes. So do you have any sort of questions about that? Does it sound clear?
Yes, well, I have a general question.
Yeah.
Why does this happen? Why are people doing incorrect movements subconsciously in the first place? Why is it not okay for someone just to go by their normal sense of feeling of doing one thing at a time?
Yes. You have to understand that human beings have no instinct. When we are born, we cannot sit down, we cannot walk. we are despondent. We need people to take care of us for a long, long time. So we are learners. Okay, you are learners, good. But when you learn, it depends on the teacher you have. And at first, of course, conscious guidance is not part of your world. You have just subconscious guidance. You learn by somatic cognition. So that is, you feel what is better for you. Of course, that type of learning is not really conscious. It's not reasonable. So you learn wrong habits. Habits are learned. Most people learn. So that explains every single deformation of the body you see. Why is it that a person is leaning to the left? Why is it that a person has a bunion on the right foot? What it is? Why is it that the person tends to sprain an ankle on the right side? Why is it that the person has a scoliosis? All these functional limitations of movements are due to, well, the kind of learning. It's somatic learning. And so this somatic cognition for me is, well, the basis of all our habits. That's why we need something more developed, that is conscious guidance and control.
So it's not that people used to have the correct movements and then somehow lost them. It's that we haven't learned to do the correct movements.
Yes, I know what you're referring to. Yes, there are many people that think that the hunter-gatherer, the old ancestor, was a perfect being with absolutely correct movements, and somehow, somewhere inside ourselves, there is this knowledge. I laugh because it's so funny, you know. I know people believe these things, but well, um, yes, we learn. You know, there's this COVID-19 epidemic at the moment, and it has been found that people that have been sedated in coma, so that they can survive it, so that they can survive the fact that they can't breathe anymore. They wake up, and it's been found that they are wasted. It means their muscles are very, very weak. They have been lying down for so long in sedation that it takes something like 6 months to get over it. And I heard one of these person coming out of the sedation, the deep sedation that he was into, and he said, "I have to learn to walk. I cannot walk. I don't know how to walk." You can take that well as a way of saying, I did not. I thought that the man was telling the truth. He found that his ability to walk using excess muscular contraction and no elastic mechanism, not his correct organization of the movements of the parts, made it for him impossible to walk anymore the way he was walking before. This man's need to learn to walk again. So obviously he's going to learn to walk again in the same way as he learned to walk the first time. We are just saying with conscious guidance and control, he could learn to walk in a very different manner. I mean, different system. And I can tell you the evolution of his learning would be much different. But this knowledge is not taught in universities. You don't go in a university to walk. It sounds stupid, you know. Everybody knows how to walk. What we say is that when the person is walking, she's performing incorrect movement unconsciously, and that it's quite interesting to have a look at it and say, well, you know how to walk, doing this, this, and this, and that. Could you stop doing this, this, and this, and that? Could you walk in a new way so that instead of being satisfied of knowing how to walk, you could think, oh, I could improve my way to walk. I could improve. Well, very often people come to me to improve their sitting. they stay all day in university, or they stay all day in conference rooms, and they discover that they suffer in sitting. Sitting is a resting position. No, they don't know how to sit without producing all sorts of trouble that are clearly related to the kind of movement they are performing more or less consciously, because very often people are, they know they lean, well, of course they have done that thing because they felt the need to. That is what we call a subconscious guidance. They had this realization, this awareness. Yes, the mind was directed toward the feeling, and they felt somehow tired. They felt some sort of pain in their back, so they wanted to rest, or to get a prop. That's the most important thing. People, if you take props away, if you say to people, don't lean on the table, don't hold your arms, don't lean back. It's like, wow, you're killing me. I can't stay like this. I can't sit like this. Well, the idea is, yes, for the moment. For the moment, you just discover that you're under subjection, you're under the control of your feelings. Your feelings are telling you, no, I cannot do this. Okay? There is a way to learn conscious guidance and control, so that the evolution of the control, the evolution of the coordination is going to be such that, yes, you can detach yourself from the feeling sense, and you can start to organize your habits that you have learned, and you organize them in a different way. So you learn new habits if you want, but more globally, you learn to see habits for what they are. They are learned repetitions. We want to break that. And inhibition, or what we call definite inhibition of movement, is the way to go. So that's a very small introduction on the idea of habits, but it's a good start. So if we want to expand on that, we can now, but it was necessary to start somewhere. So definite inhibition is a very good start, I think.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeando. For people watching the video, if you check out the show notes underneath, there's links to Jeando's websites, and we'll see you in the next interview. Thanks, Jeando. Bye-bye.
Thank you.